The blue lights weren't there a second ago. One moment you're just driving home, thinking about nothing in particular, maybe replaying your day in your head, and the next moment the entire road behind you is painted in red and blue reflections. That quiet hum inside the car suddenly feels louder. Your hands tighten on the steering wheel without you even realizing it. You check your mirrors again, even though you already know what's happening. And then it hits you, the moment every driver has experienced at least once, or at least feared imagining. You're being pulled over. The patrol car settles behind you. The silence inside your vehicle becomes uncomfortable in a way that's hard to explain. It's not just about the ticket anymore, it's about what happens next. The officer is walking up. You're watching in the rearview mirror, trying to read their expression before they even reach your window. Now let me ask you something directly, and I want you to be honest with yourself. Have you ever been pulled over and felt completely unsure about what you were supposed to say when the officer started asking questions about your car, your travel, or what was inside your vehicle? And I want you to drop your answer in the comments. Not just a simple yes or no, but what actually happened in that moment. Because if you've ever felt confused, pressured, or unsure during a traffic stop, what I'm about to explain might change the way you handle it forever. There's a lot about roadside searches that most drivers misunderstand, and later in this conversation, I'm going to break down one of the biggest legal myths that puts people at a serious disadvantage without them even realizing it. But first, let's stay in that moment at the window. The officer approaches, knocks lightly on the glass, you roll it down, and immediately, the conversation begins in a tone that sounds casual but carries weight underneath it. License, registration, proof of insurance, standard. But then something shifts. The officer starts asking questions that don't feel standard anymore. Where are you coming from? Where are you headed? Is there anything illegal in the vehicle today? Sometimes it sounds friendly, sometimes it feels more direct. Either way, the direction is clear. The focus is no longer just your driving, it's your car. This is where most drivers start making mistakes without even realizing it. Because in the United States, police do not automatically have the right to search your vehicle just because they pulled you over. That's the starting point, and it matters. The Fourth Amendment protects against unreasonable searches and seizures. But cars are treated differently than homes, and that difference is where most confusion begins. Courts have consistently held that vehicles have a lower expectation of privacy because they are mobile and operate in public spaces. That means officers have more flexibility during traffic stops, but it does not mean they can search your car whenever they want. So the real question isn't whether police can search your car, it's when they legally can. And more importantly, how drivers accidentally give them permission without realizing it. Let's break it down the way it actually plays out in real roadside situations. One of the most common ways a search begins is consent. That sounds simple, but in real life it's anything but simple. An officer might say something like, "Do you mind if I take a quick look inside your vehicle?" On the surface, it sounds like a request. It feels optional. But the psychology behind it is important. You're standing on the roadside, cars are passing, the officer is in uniform, there is authority, presence, and pressure even if no threats are made. Many drivers feel like saying no will automatically escalate the situation, so they say yes, even when they don't want to. That single word opens the door legally. If you consent, the officer does not need probable cause. They don't need a warrant, your permission is enough. And what most people don't realize is that consent doesn't have to be enthusiastic, it just has to be voluntary under the law. Courts often look at whether a reasonable person would have felt pressured, but in practice, it's very difficult to challenge once it has already happened. Now imagine another situation. You're pulled over for speeding, everything seems routine, but the officer is watching you closely. Not just your answers, but your behavior. Are you avoiding eye contact? Are your hands shaking? Are you speaking too quickly? Are you overly defensive? Or maybe too quiet? Officers are trained to observe behavior patterns, not because nervousness is illegal, but because they're trying to assess risk. In their mind, a traffic stop can escalate quickly if something is off, so they start building a picture based on small details. But here's where drivers get into trouble. Nervousness is not evidence of anything illegal, yet it is often interpreted alongside other factors. And if something else is present, like inconsistent answers or suspicious behavior, the situation can escalate quickly. Now the officer asks again, maybe differently this time. "You don't mind if I take a quick look inside, right?" This is where pressure builds, And this is where another legal principle comes into play: probable cause. Unlike consent, probable cause does not require your permission. If an officer has a reasonable belief based on facts and observations that evidence of a crime is inside the vehicle, they can search without consent. That belief doesn't have to be certainty. It has to be reasonable under the circumstances. For example, if an officer smells marijuana coming from the car, that alone has historically been used as probable cause in many jurisdictions. If they see drug paraphernalia in plain view, that can justify a search. If a driver admits to something incriminating during questioning, that can shift everything immediately. This is why conversations during traffic stops matter more than most drivers realize, because what you say in those first few minutes can completely change the legal landscape of the stop. There's also something called the plain view doctrine. If an officer is lawfully in a position and sees something illegal without searching, that observation can be used as justification to go further. A partially open glove box, a visible weapon, or suspicious packages can all become part of that chain of reasoning. Then there is another scenario that surprises many drivers. The officer asks you to step out of the vehicle. Most people assume they can refuse. In reality, in many situations, police can lawfully ask or even require a driver to exit during a traffic stop for officer safety. Courts have generally supported this practice because traffic stops are considered inherently risky situations for law enforcement. So even if you haven't done anything wrong, you may still be asked to step out while the stop continues. And once you're outside the vehicle, your car is more exposed than ever. Now let's talk about one of the most misunderstood moments in a traffic stop: the pause. You hand over your documents, the officer takes them back to the patrol car, and you're left sitting there, watching, waiting. This is often when something else happens. Backup arrives, another officer shows up, or sometimes a canine unit appears nearby. That's not random. In many cases, officers are building time and conditions to strengthen their position. A trained drug detection dog, for example, does not require probable cause to walk around a vehicle during a lawful stop. If the dog alerts, that alert can establish probable cause for a search. This is why timing matters during stops more than people realize. A stop that feels routine at first can shift into something much more serious, depending on what develops during those minutes. Now let's talk about passengers, because they are often forgotten in these situations. Passengers do have rights, but they are also subject to questioning. Officers can ask for identification depending on the state and circumstances, and they can ask passengers questions about where they are going or what they know. However, passengers are generally not obligated to answer beyond basic identification requirements unless a lawful reason exists. Still, in real situations, passengers often feel just as pressured as the driver, and sometimes even more so, because they didn't even initiate the stop. Another moment that changes everything is tone. If you've ever noticed how an officer's tone can shift during a stop, that is not your imagination. A stop can begin casually and gradually become more serious depending on answers, behavior, or observations. That shift is often subtle. The questions become more precise, the pauses become longer, the focus narrows. And once that shift happens, drivers who panic or become argumentative often make the situation worse without realizing it. Because from the officer's perspective, resistance, aggression, or inconsistency doesn't help de-escalate uncertainty. It often increases it. Now here's something many drivers misunderstand. Remaining silent is a right in certain contexts, especially when questions move toward potential criminal exposure. But silence does not prevent a search if legal grounds already exist, and silence alone can sometimes be interpreted alongside other factors, depending on the situation. This is where people often get confused by internet advice that oversimplifies everything. You'll hear phrases like, "just refuse everything," or "they can't search without a warrant." But reality is far more complex. Because in vehicle searches, warrants are often not required if one of the exceptions applies. And those exceptions are what actually shape roadside encounters in real life. Consent is one, probable cause is another, search incident to arrest is another, although more limited than many people think under modern rulings like Arizona vs. Gantt. Inventory searches after towing a vehicle are also common, especially when a car is impounded. Each of these scenarios has its own legal framework, but from a driver's perspective, they can feel like one continuous unfolding event. Now let's talk about a situation that escalates quickly and catches many drivers off guard: The officer says something like, "Step out of the vehicle for me," then follows with, "I'm just going to take a quick look inside to make sure everything is okay." Notice how that language works. It sounds routine, it sounds harmless, but legally it is often the turning point where a consensual interaction shifts into a search based on either consent or developing probable cause. Many drivers, trying to be cooperative, don't realize they are effectively allowing a search to begin. And once a search starts, it does not always stop immediately, even if you change your mind. This is why understanding your rights matters before you're ever in that moment. Because once you're standing on the roadside, with lights flashing, traffic moving past you, and an officer waiting for your response, decisions feel different than they do in theory. Let's talk about a few of the most common mistakes drivers make, not as a checklist, but as patterns that show up again and again. One is over-explaining. Drivers feel like talking more will help them avoid trouble, but sometimes it does the opposite. Inconsistent explanations can raise suspicion even when nothing illegal is happening. Another is panic compliance, saying yes to searches out of fear or pressure without fully understanding the consequences. Another is arguing on the roadside. Even when a driver believes they are right, the roadside is not the place where legal arguments are resolved. It often only escalates tension. And another is misunderstanding what free to go means. Many drivers don't realize they can ask whether they are being detained or whether they are free to leave. That question can clarify the nature of the stop, but it must be asked calmly and appropriately. Now here's something I want to emphasize because it's one of the most important psychological aspects of traffic stops that almost nobody talks about. Officers are not just listening to your words. They are building a timeline of your behavior from the moment the stop begins. How quickly you pulled over, whether you were fumbling for documents, whether your story changes, whether there is hesitation in answers, whether your vehicle contains multiple indicators that don't align. None of these things alone determine anything, but together they form a picture. And that picture is what determines whether a stop stays routine or becomes something more serious. This is also why staying calm matters, not in a vague motivational sense, but in a very practical sense. Calm communication reduces misinterpretation. It keeps interactions predictable. It avoids unnecessary escalation. Now, there is a myth that needs to be addressed carefully, and I promised earlier that we would come back to something important. Many people believe that simply refusing a search will prevent it entirely. That is not accurate. Refusing consent is your right, but if the officer already has probable cause or another legal basis, the search can still proceed. In fact, refusing consent sometimes leads officers to rely more closely on other legal justifications they believe they already have. This is where misunderstanding becomes risky, because believing in an absolute rule that doesn't exist can lead people to act in ways that unintentionally escalate situations. The reality is more nuanced. Rights exist, but they operate within structured legal exceptions that depend on facts, observations, and circumstances. And that is exactly why traffic stops feel so unpredictable to so many drivers. Because what looks like a simple stop for speeding can evolve based on human interaction, perception, and legal thresholds that are not visible in the moment. As this conversation continues, one thing should become clear. A traffic stop is not just about paperwork or driving behavior. It is a layered interaction involving law, psychology, and rapid decision-making on both sides of the window. And whether a vehicle gets searched or not often comes down to small moments that most people never think about until they're already living through them. The engine is still running, the lights are still flashing, the officer is still there waiting for your response. And everything that happens next depends on what you understand about that moment before you even speak.